Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it quickly from your gut. You've been working on a project for 6 months. You've put in hundreds of hours. The money you spent is gone, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the project is not going to work. Do you keep going or do you stop? If your honest answer was keep going, because I've already invested so much, then you've just demonstrated one of the most common and most costly thinking errors that the human brain makes, and you're in excellent company, because virtually every person on Earth makes exactly this mistake, including highly intelligent, highly educated people who know about this error, have read about it, and still fall into it anyway. That error has a name. It's called the sunk cost fallacy, and it's one of 99 specific, systematically recurring thinking errors that a Swiss author and entrepreneur named Rolf Dobelli cataloged in a book first published in German in 2011 and in English in 2013. The book is called The Art of Thinking Clearly, and it has sold over 3 million copies worldwide, been translated into more than 45 languages, and spent more than 80 consecutive weeks in the top 10 of Germany's bestseller lists. It has become, for many readers, something close to an owner's manual for a brain that came without one. Rolf Dobelli was born in 1966 in Switzerland. He studied business administration and philosophy, received a doctorate from the University of St. Gallen, and spent several years working as a CEO for subsidiaries of Swissair before transitioning to writing and entrepreneurship. He is the founder of WorldMinds, a private community of some of the world's leading scientists, artists, and thinkers, and a co-founder of GetAbstract, one of the world's largest book summary services. He began studying cognitive biases and behavioral economics after meeting Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan and Antifragile, and spending years in correspondence with researchers in psychology and behavioral economics. By his own account, he began compiling his list of cognitive errors originally for himself, as a kind of personal insurance against the predictable irrationality that he could see costing himself and the people around him real money, real relationships, and real opportunity, often without anyone involved fully realizing what had happened. The book's central argument is stated in its introduction with unusual bluntness. We don't need new ideas, new gadgets, more information, or more frenetic activity to make better decisions. We need less irrationality. And less irrationality, Dobelli argues, is achievable not by becoming superhumanly rational, which is impossible, but by becoming aware of the specific, predictable, repeating patterns through which our thinking reliably goes wrong, and by designing our choices and environments to compensate for them rather than hoping they won't apply to us. This is a significantly different framing from the typical personal development premise. Most books in this space promise to give you something, a system, a practice, a set of tools for becoming better. This book offers something that initially sounds like less, a map of what not to do, a catalog of errors to avoid, a tool for removing the things that distort your decisions rather than adding new things to improve them. Dobelli uses Michelangelo as his model. The great sculptor once said that every block of marble already contains the finished statue, and the sculptor's job is simply to remove everything that isn't the statue. The art of thinking clearly suggests that every person already contains the capacity for clearer thinking, and the primary task is to chip away the systematic errors that prevent it. In this video, I want to do something somewhat different from what most summaries of this book do. Most summaries simply list the 99 biases, which is useful as a reference, but doesn't really convey what makes the book valuable as an experience. Instead, I want to walk you through the most important, most practically significant, and most counterintuitive of the biases the book covers, organized around the kinds of situations they affect most, Explain the mechanism behind each one so you understand not just what the error is, but why your brain makes it. Show how they operate in the specific context of your daily decisions, and give you the thing the book itself emphasizes most. Not just knowledge of the biases, which is necessary but not sufficient, but a few practical habits of mind that actually change behavior. Let's begin. The first category of errors, and the one that Dobelli places first in his book for good reason, concerns how we perceive success and failure. The opening bias is survivorship bias, and it is almost certainly distorting your understanding of success in every domain where you care about it. The mechanism is simple. We can only observe what exists, what survived, what made it to the finish line. The businesses that succeeded are visible. Their offices, their products, their founders' profiles in magazines, their case studies in business schools. The businesses that failed are invisible. They closed, they were forgotten, they left no trace in the information environment you inhabit. This asymmetry means that your entire picture of what it takes to build a successful business is drawn exclusively from the evidence of successful businesses, which is a deeply biased sample. You're studying the lottery winners and drawing conclusions about what makes people good at the lottery, without ever looking at the millions of people who played the same numbers and won nothing. This matters practically in nearly every domain. The biographies of successful authors tell you what great writers do. They don't tell you what equally talented writers who never got published did differently, or whether they did anything differently at all. The success stories of bold entrepreneurs tell you about bold entrepreneurs who succeeded. They almost never prominently feature the equally bold entrepreneurs who went bankrupt using nearly identical strategies. Survivorship bias makes every success look more like the inevitable result of particular qualities and choices than it actually is, by systematically hiding the counterexamples that would complicate the picture. The practical countermeasure is to actively seek out the failures alongside the successes. Before you model your career on a successful person's path, ask what percentage of people who followed a similar path succeeded. Before you adopt a strategy because it worked for a famous company, ask how many companies tried the same strategy and failed without becoming famous. Before you read a book on what successful investors do, look at what unsuccessful investors did differently, if anything. The information is often harder to find, but it is enormously more useful for actual decision-making than the survivorship-biased picture that naturally forms from the available evidence. The sunk cost fallacy, which I opened this video with, operates on a simple but powerful mechanism. Our brains treat past investment, whether of money, time, or effort, as an ongoing reason to continue investing, even when the rational analysis of future costs and benefits no longer justifies the investment. The sunk cost fallacy is the reason people sit through terrible movies rather than leaving, because they paid for the ticket. It is the reason people stay in failing relationships longer than they should, because of the years they've already put in. It is the reason companies continue pouring resources into projects that their own internal analysis shows will never return their costs, because the sunk costs are psychologically visible while the opportunity costs, the other things those resources could be doing, are psychologically invisible. The rational framework for avoiding sunk cost thinking is to practice asking one specific question whenever you're evaluating whether to continue something. If I were starting this from scratch today, with no prior investment, would I choose to do this? If the honest answer is no, then the sunk cost is pushing you to continue something that a rational assessment of future value does not support. The past investment is gone. It cannot be recovered by continuing. The only question that rationally matters is what the future looks like from here. And if the future doesn't justify continuation, the sunk cost never will. Confirmation bias is arguably the most pervasive and most dangerous of all cognitive errors, because it operates in the most intimate domain, how you process the evidence that comes before you every day. The mechanism is this. Your brain preferentially notices, processes, and retains information that confirms what you already believe, while tending to dismiss, discount, or forget information that contradicts it. This isn't a conscious decision. It happens automatically, below the level of deliberate thought, which is what makes it so difficult to catch in yourself. The consequences of confirmation bias ripple through every domain of thinking and decision-making. An investor who believes a particular company is undervalued will find the positive indicators more persuasive and the negative ones more dismissible. A doctor who has formed a preliminary diagnosis will interpret ambiguous symptoms as consistent with that diagnosis rather than as reasons to reconsider it. A person whose political views have formed will find the news sources that confirm those views more credible and the ones that challenge them more suspicious. And in each case, the person experiencing the bias is not lying to themselves. They genuinely believe they are processing the evidence rationally. The bias is not visible from the inside. The practical countermeasure Dobelli recommends is deliberately seeking disconfirming evidence. Not just more evidence for what you already believe, but specifically evidence that, if true, would prove you wrong. Write down your most important beliefs about investments, about relationships, about your own abilities and choices, and set out to find the arguments against them. This is genuinely uncomfortable because we have a deep psychological investment in being right about things we've decided. But the discomfort is the price of clarity, and clarity is exactly what this book is selling. Let's move to a cluster of biases that operate in social contexts, because some of the most costly errors we make don't happen alone in front of spreadsheets. They happen in rooms full of other people. Social proof is the tendency to use other people's behavior as evidence of what is correct, wise, or appropriate. It is the mechanism behind fashion, trends, crowd behavior, financial bubbles, and the feeling that something must be worth doing because many other people are doing it. Social proof was genuinely adaptive through most of human evolutionary history. In a world without Wikipedia or scientific institutions, using the behavior of experienced members of your community as a guide to safe foods, safe paths, and appropriate behavior was often the most rational available shortcut. In the modern world, social proof misfires predictably and sometimes catastrophically. Financial markets are perhaps the most dramatic example. Asset bubbles form precisely because the rising price of something becomes, through social proof, evidence that it is a good investment, causing more people to buy, causing the price to rise further, creating more social proof of its value, until the cycle breaks in a way that reveals that the underlying asset was never worth what people were collectively paying for it. The dot-com bubble and the 2008 housing crisis are both, at some level, stories about what happens when social proof displaces individual analysis of actual value. The practical countermeasure to social proof is to consistently ask, when you notice yourself being influenced by what others are doing, why are these other people doing this? Have they actually thought it through, or are they themselves responding to social proof? Is there independent evidence that this is the right choice, or is the primary evidence simply that many people are making it? Popularity is not a proxy for wisdom. As Dobelli quotes in the title of one of his chapters, if 50 million people say something foolish, it is still foolish. Authority bias is the related tendency to defer automatically to people who appear to have expertise or status, without adequately evaluating whether their authority in their specific domain actually validates their particular claim. We evolved to follow the guidance of experienced elders and specialists, and in the ancestral environment this was generally adaptive. In the modern world, The mismatch between where someone's genuine expertise lies and the domain about which they're speaking or making decisions is a common source of costly errors. The practical implication is to ask, whenever you're inclined to defer to an authority, is this person genuinely expert in the specific thing I'm asking them about? Surgeons are expert in surgery, but this doesn't make them expert in whether surgery is the right treatment for your particular condition compared to less invasive alternatives, which surgeons notoriously tend to underweight because their training has given them a tool, surgery, and tools shape the problems you see. Economists are expert in certain modeling approaches, but this doesn't necessarily make their predictions about complex real-world economic events reliably accurate, as the 2008 financial crisis demonstrated when virtually every prominent economist failed to predict or correctly diagnose the event as it unfolded. The halo effect is the cognitive shortcut by which we allow one strongly positive characteristic of a person or thing to color our assessment of their other characteristics. The attractive person is assumed to be more competent, more trustworthy, and more intelligent than the evidence independently supports. The impressive resume makes the hearing manager more forgiving of the weak answer in the interview. The charismatic speaker seems more correct than the equally competent but less magnetic speaker presenting the same information. The expensive product seems higher quality than the cheaper one, even when objective quality measures show no difference. The halo effect matters in professional contexts because it means that the actual information being evaluated, the job candidate's specific skills, the product's actual performance, the investment's actual fundamentals, is consistently contaminated by irrelevant but perceptually powerful signals that have nothing to do with what you're supposedly evaluating. The countermeasure is to evaluate important decisions along specific, independent dimensions rather than as holistic impressions, writing down separate assessments of specific qualities before integrating them, rather than allowing an overall impression to substitute for the analysis. Let's now move to a cluster of biases concerning how we relate to probability, risk, and randomness, because this is an area where human intuition is systematically unreliable in ways that have enormous practical consequences. The availability heuristic is the tendency to estimate the probability of something based on how easily examples of it come to mind. Things that are vivid, recent, or emotionally charged come to mind more easily and are therefore judged to be more probable than things that are statistically more common but less memorable or emotionally salient. Plane crashes, shark attacks, and terrorist attacks are dramatically overestimated as risks because the few instances that occur are extensively covered in media and strongly emotionally encoded, while the much more common but less dramatic risks, driving, heart disease from poor diet, slipping in the shower, are underestimated because they are ordinary, expected, and produce no memorable news stories. The availability heuristic has direct consequences for personal decision-making. People who recently heard a vivid story about an investment that went spectacularly wrong are more risk-averse toward investments than statistics would justify. People who recently heard a vivid story about an investment that went spectacularly right are less risk-averse than statistics would justify. Neither response is driven by an accurate assessment of the underlying probabilities. Both are driven by what is most available in memory, which is a function of vividness and recency rather than frequency or statistical significance. The countermeasure is to deliberately consult base rates, the actual statistical frequencies of outcomes in the relevant domain, rather than relying on the examples that come to mind most easily. Before making any significant decision involving probability, ask, what is the actual rate at which this kind of thing succeeds or fails across all the cases, not just the memorable ones? The planning fallacy is the systematic tendency to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions while overestimating their benefits. This is nearly universal. Studies across many domains show that people consistently predict their projects will be completed faster, cost less, and produce more benefit than they actually do. The famous example is the Sydney Opera House, which was projected to cost $7 million and take 4 years to build, and which actually cost $102 million and took 14 years. The planning fallacy operates because, when we think about our own future projects, we imagine them in ideal conditions, without the inevitable complications, obstacles, and unexpected delays that appear in the actual execution of virtually every project. We picture the best-case scenario while telling ourselves we're being realistic. The countermeasure is to use what the psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls the outside view. Instead of imagining how your specific project will unfold, look at how similar projects have actually performed historically. If construction projects of this type regularly take twice as long and cost 50% more than planned, your project is not the exception unless you have specific evidence that it will be. Take the base rate seriously and adjust your estimates accordingly. Loss aversion, documented extensively by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their foundational work on prospect theory, is the well-established finding that people experience the pain of losing something as approximately twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining an equivalent thing. Losing $100 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining $100 feels good. This asymmetry has profound implications for decision-making under uncertainty, because it means that people will systematically make different choices about gambles framed as potential losses than they will make about economically identical gambles framed as potential gains. Loss aversion explains why people hold onto losing investments long past the point when rational analysis would suggest selling, because selling crystallizes the loss, making it real and final, while holding maintains the psychological possibility, however remote, of recovery. It explains why status quo bias, the tendency to prefer the current state of affairs over change even when change would objectively improve outcomes, is so persistent. Changing from the status quo means giving up something you already have, and the pain of that loss outweighs the equivalent benefit of what the change would deliver. The practical countermeasure is to make yourself consciously aware of when loss framing is driving your evaluation, and to reframe the decision in terms of its actual expected value, independent of whether your starting point is having something or not having it. If you would not buy an investment you currently hold at its current price, there is no rational reason to keep holding it other than loss aversion, because the relevant question is always what this investment will do from now, not what it has done or how much you paid for it. Let's now move to a cluster of biases that concern how we construct our own knowledge, how we tell ourselves we know things, and how we evaluate our own competence and the competence of others. The overconfidence effect is perhaps the most thoroughly documented finding in all of cognitive psychology. People consistently overestimate the accuracy of their own knowledge, predictions, and judgment. When asked to give a 90% confidence interval for answers to factual questions, meaning a range you are 90% sure contains the correct answer, most people's 90% confidence intervals actually contain the correct answer only about 50 to 60% of the time. We are systematically more certain than we have any right to be, across virtually every domain studied. The overconfidence effect matters most in domains where its consequences are largest: financial decisions, medical diagnoses, engineering estimates, and professional judgments about complex systems. The surgeon who is 95% confident in a treatment decision is typically correct far less often than that. The investor who is certain a particular company is undervalued by the market is usually overestimating his ability to identify what markets of millions of participants have somehow missed. The entrepreneur who is confident their product will succeed has almost certainly been distorted in their assessment by the combination of the planning fallacy, survivorship bias, and the overconfidence effect acting in concert. The countermeasure Dobelli recommends is deliberately widening your confidence intervals. When you estimate something or make a prediction, give yourself a range rather than a point estimate, and make the range larger than feels right, because the range that feels right is almost certainly too narrow. Then track your predictions over time to see whether your actual accuracy matches your stated confidence, which it almost never does, and which the tracking will make viscerally clear. Hindsight bias is the tendency, after an event has occurred, to believe that you knew it was going to happen before it did, even when your actual prior state of knowledge was far more uncertain. After the financial crisis of 2008, the story most people told was that the signs were obvious, that anyone paying attention should have seen it coming. In the years before 2008, the same people making the same observations about the same data were genuinely uncertain, and the vast majority of professional economists, analysts, and investors failed to predict the crash. But hindsight bias rewrites our memory of what the future looked like before it became the past. Hindsight bias matters practically for two reasons. First, it prevents genuine learning from mistakes, because the misremembering of what we actually knew before an event means we can't accurately identify what went wrong in our decision-making process that led to a bad outcome. Second, it leads to systematic misjudgments of other people's decisions, particularly when we're evaluating decisions that had bad outcomes in retrospect. We judge people more harshly for decisions that happen to have bad outcomes than for decisions that were identical in quality but happened to turn out well. The countermeasure is to keep records of your actual predictions and assessments before events unfold, so that you have something accurate to compare against the memory you'll form after the fact. This is uncomfortable, because the record usually shows that you were considerably less certain and considerably less accurate in your predictions than your post-event memory suggests. But it is the only reliable way to calibrate your actual judgment rather than your remembered version of it. The story bias is the tendency for the human brain to prefer information packaged as narratives over equivalent information presented as data, even when the narrative structure actively distorts the underlying reality. We are story-making machines. Our ancestors processed their world through stories, myths, and narrative explanations long before they had statistical tools or scientific methods, and this orientation is deeply embedded in how our brains process incoming information. The problem with story bias in the modern world is that stories impose a kind of false coherence on events that may in reality be considerably more random, complex, and multi-causal than any single narrative can capture. When the media covers a business failure, it finds a story. The founder was arrogant, the pivot was mistimed, the culture was broken. These elements may be real, but the selection of them as the definitive explanation for the failure almost certainly obscures the role of factors that don't make good narrative. Bad luck, market timing, the random chance of which competitor happened to launch a similar product 3 months earlier. The countermeasure is to become deliberately suspicious of very clean, compelling explanations for complex events. When a story feels too satisfying, too coherent, too obvious, it is probably too simple. Real events in complex systems almost never have the clean causal structure that narrative requires, and the simplification required to turn them into good stories regularly distorts the picture in ways that mislead subsequent decision-making. The chauffeur knowledge bias, which Dobelli names after a famous story about Max Planck, the physicist, is the distinction between real knowledge and the sophisticated performance of knowledge. The story goes that after Planck won the Nobel Prize, his chauffeur drove him to lecture after lecture where Planck delivered the same talk. The chauffeur, having heard the talk so many times, memorized it. He eventually proposed to Planck that they switch places for one lecture, which they did. When a physicist in the audience asked the chauffeur a difficult technical question, the chauffeur smoothly responded, "That question is so elementary that even my chauffeur back there could answer it." And he pointed to Planck. The practical point is that our world is full of chauffeur knowledge. People who can speak fluently and confidently about a subject, who know all the vocabulary, all the names, all the surface structure of expertise, but who lack the deep, working, tested understanding that genuine expertise represents. And crucially, it is often very difficult to distinguish chauffeur knowledge from genuine expertise from the outside, particularly because genuine experts are often less fluent and more hesitant than chauffeurs. Because real knowledge includes knowing the boundaries and uncertainties that confident chauffeurs have never noticed. The countermeasure is to ask specific, probing, edge case questions rather than accepting confident general statements as evidence of genuine expertise. The chauffeur will have a smooth answer. The genuine expert will often say, "That's a good question and I'm not entirely sure. Here's how I'd think about it." Decision fatigue is a finding from psychology that is practically significant and dramatically underappreciated. Willpower and the quality of decision-making are depleted resources that diminish over the course of a day as more decisions are made. By the end of a day of many decisions, people make systematically worse choices than they make in the morning, typically defaulting to whatever requires the least cognitive effort, which is usually the status quo, the comfortable option, or the thing that was most recently mentioned. The practical implications of decision fatigue are wide-ranging. Important decisions should be made early in the day, not late in the afternoon or evening when resources are depleted. Medical professionals and judges, whose decision-making quality at the end of the day has real consequences for the people they're serving, should be particularly alert to this effect. And in any situation where you are trying to influence a decision-maker, the timing of your request relative to their decision load for the day matters considerably more than most people realize. The countermeasure for your own decision-making is to front-load important decisions to the parts of the day when your cognitive resources are freshest. Reduce the total number of decisions you make by creating rules, defaults, and systems that handle recurring choices automatically. And be particularly skeptical of the choices you make and the agreements you enter when you are tired, hungry, or in the late stages of a long meeting. Now let's talk about something the book addresses that is both practically important and philosophically interesting: the question of when to follow rules versus when to exercise judgment. The book makes a case, grounded in the research of psychologists like Gerd Giedrenzer, that simple rules often outperform complex analysis in conditions of genuine uncertainty. When a situation is characterized by irreducible uncertainty, when the relevant variables are too many and too interdependent, and too poorly understood for analysis to reliably improve on a well-chosen heuristic, following a simple rule tends to produce better outcomes than attempting to reason through every consideration. This is a counterintuitive result, because we generally assume that more careful, more thorough, more sophisticated analysis produces better decisions. In stable, well-understood domains, this is often true. In conditions of genuine uncertainty with many interacting variables, complex models can amplify errors rather than canceling them, while simple rules that capture the most important single factor often outperform. The practical implication is to be very honest about whether you are operating in a domain where genuine analysis can improve on reasonable heuristics. In domains characterized by complex feedback, many variables, and genuine uncertainty, like predicting the performance of individual stocks over a one-year period, the evidence consistently suggests that simple, low-cost index investing outperforms the sophisticated analysis of professional stock pickers, not because the analysis is wrong, but because the uncertainty is genuine and the costs of complexity accumulate. In domains characterized by well-understood causal mechanisms and reliable feedback, like engineering a bridge or diagnosing a straightforward medical condition, sophisticated analysis justifiably outperforms simple heuristics. Let's now talk about some of the social and emotional biases that distort thinking in ways that are particularly difficult to recognize, because they feel like virtues rather than errors. In-group out-group bias is the tendency to evaluate members of our own social, professional, or cultural group more favorably than members of other groups, applying more charitable interpretations to their actions and more demanding standards of evidence to their transgressions. This bias is universal across cultures and virtually impossible to fully eliminate because it is deeply embedded in the psychology of social belonging. The practical consequence is that people in organizations consistently evaluate colleagues in their department more favorably than equally competent people in other departments. Investors evaluate companies from their own country more favorably than equally strong companies in other countries. And people in ideological communities consistently apply different evidentiary standards to claims that confirm versus challenge their community's views. The practical countermeasure is to be specifically alert to your evaluations of people and claims from groups you identify with strongly, and to ask whether you would apply the same level of charitable interpretation and the same standard of evidence if the person or claim came from a different group. Envy and jealousy drive decision-making in ways people find particularly difficult to acknowledge or examine honestly. Dobelli treats these not as moral failures but as cognitive biases, systematic distortions in how we perceive and respond to information about other people's circumstances. The practical problem with envy is that it makes relative position, how you're doing compared to others, more salient than absolute position, how you're actually doing. People regularly make choices that worsen their absolute position while improving their relative one, choosing a worse outcome for themselves in order to prevent a better one for a competitor, accepting a bad deal rather than seeing the other party do well, working against a colleague's advancement, even when that advancement has no material effect on their own position. These behaviors are economically irrational, but they are psychologically very real and very common, and they are driven by a feature of human emotional architecture that was adaptive in environments where relative status genuinely mattered for survival and reproduction, and that misfires in environments where it doesn't. The contrast effect is the tendency to evaluate things not in absolute terms, but relative to what has been presented alongside them. A salary offer looks impressive relative to a low anchor you set up at the start of the negotiation, even if the same salary offer would look poor relative to what you know comparable positions pay. A house looks attractive after you've been shown several significantly worse ones, regardless of whether it is objectively a good value. A product looks competitively priced next to an extremely expensive alternative, even when it is expensive relative to the market as a whole. The practical countermeasure is to establish an absolute reference point before you are shown relative comparisons. Know what a good salary for this position looks like before you receive an offer. Know what a fair price for this type of property looks like before you tour specific houses. Know what value you're genuinely getting from a product before you see it positioned against more expensive alternatives. Once you're inside the comparison environment, your brain will automatically use the available contrasts as reference points, and there's very little conscious effort can do to fully override this tendency. Let me now spend some time on the book's practical philosophy, the underlying framework for what to do with this catalog of cognitive errors, because knowing about biases and actually changing behavior are very different things. The book's most important practical claim is that recognizing biases in real time, as they're happening, is much harder than people assume when they first learn about them. Most people who read about the sunk cost fallacy feel confident they would not continue a failing project because of past investment. Most of these people, when actually in that situation, continue the failing project anyway. The intellectual knowledge of the bias is not the same as the practical capacity to override it in the moment, because the bias operates at a level of emotional response that is faster and more automatic than conscious reasoning. The solution the book advocates is therefore not primarily to cultivate real-time bias recognition, though that is worth attempting. The more reliable solution is to design your decision-making environment and your decision-making processes to compensate for biases structurally, in advance, before you're in the heat of the moment when the bias is actually operating. This means creating rules that bind future behavior. Investment policies written down in advance that specify under what conditions you will sell, rather than deciding in the heat of a market swing. It means seeking out people who will actively disagree with you and whose job is to poke holes in your reasoning, rather than building teams of like-minded people who reinforce your existing views. It means creating habits of pre-commitment, deciding in advance what you will do if certain conditions arise, rather than leaving decisions to the moment of decision when all the biases are running at full strength. The book introduces an idea it calls via negativa, borrowed from theology, where the term refers to understanding God through what he is not rather than through positive description. In the context of decision-making, via negativa means improving outcomes primarily by eliminating errors rather than by pursuing excellence. The sculptor doesn't add clay, he removes stone. The clear thinker doesn't primarily add more analysis. He removes the systematic errors that corrupt the analysis that is already happening. This is the meta-insight that gives the book its title and its organizing principle. The art of thinking clearly is not primarily the art of thinking more carefully, more elaborately, with more information and more sophisticated models. It is primarily the art of recognizing and removing the errors that cloud the thinking you're already doing. The art is subtractive, not additive. And this, it turns out, is both more achievable and more consequential than the additive version. Let's now look at a few more specific biases that have high practical significance and that the book covers in illuminating ways. The anchoring effect is the phenomenon by which the first number you hear in a context influences your subsequent numerical judgments in ways that have nothing to do with the relevance of that first number. In negotiations, the party that names a number first creates an anchor around which subsequent discussion is organized, even if that number was essentially arbitrary. In salary negotiations, whether the initial offer is high or low has a significant effect on the final agreed salary, independent of the qualifications of the candidate or the market rate for the position. In retail, a product displayed next to a much more expensive alternative seems more reasonably priced, even if the expensive alternative has no relationship to the actual value of the first product. The countermeasure to anchoring is to form your independent estimate of the appropriate value before you are exposed to an anchor. Once you have heard a number, its influence is very difficult to fully remove through conscious effort. But if you know what you think something is worth before you hear what someone else says it is worth, you are in a much stronger position to evaluate their number critically. The reciprocity trap is less a cognitive error in the traditional sense than a social norm that is routinely exploited to produce decisions that don't serve the decision maker's interests. The norm of reciprocity, the deeply embedded human tendency to return favors and feel obligated to people who have given us things, is in general an adaptive and valuable social mechanism. It becomes a trap when it is deliberately triggered by parties who want something from you. The free gift that creates obligation, the unsolicited concession in a negotiation that creates pressure to make a corresponding concession, the favor offered before the request is made rather than as a response to it. The awareness of reciprocity as a mechanism, and the deliberate decision to separate the question of what you owe someone from the question of what is appropriate given your own interests and values, is the countermeasure. A free sample obligates you to nothing unless you choose it to. A concession in a negotiation is most appropriately responded to by considering what the concession is worth to you, not by what social pressure suggests you should offer in return. Before we move toward the final section, let me spend some time on one of the most important and most rarely acknowledged points the book makes: that cognitive biases interact and amplify each other, so that the greatest decision-making disasters are usually not the result of a single error, but of multiple errors operating simultaneously and reinforcing each other. The classic example the book uses is the financial bubble. The people who were most deeply invested in dot-com stocks in 1999 or in real estate in 2006 were typically experiencing survivorship bias because the only stories they heard were of people who had made money, social proof because everyone around them seemed to be investing and profiting, confirmation bias because they were seeking out information that confirmed the wisdom of their position, overconfidence because their experience of recent gains had inflated their sense of their own insight, loss aversion working in reverse, making them hold positions long past rational analysis justified, anchoring to the prices they had paid and the gains they had seen, availability bias because the vivid, recent experience of gains was more psychologically salient than the possibility of losses, and the planning fallacy, because their mental model of how things would develop was far more optimistic than historical base rates warranted. Any one of these biases would have pushed their decision-making in a problematic direction. Together, they created a complete and mutually reinforcing distortion of reality that felt, from the inside, like particularly clear thinking, because each element of the worldview confirmed the others. This is why major financial crashes and other collective failures of judgment are so difficult to prevent. The people inside the distortion experience it as clarity, and the people trying to point out the distortion from outside appear, to those inside, to be the confused ones. The practical implication is not to become paranoid or to distrust all your assessments. It is to be specifically alert to situations where multiple biases seem to be pushing you in the same direction, because that is precisely when you are most at risk of a significant error, and most likely to feel most confident that you are not. Let's run through a quick tour of some additional biases that deserve mention even in a summary, because the book's 99 entries cover territory that a focused treatment of the major ones cannot fully capture. The IKEA effect is the tendency to overvalue things you have built or created yourself, simply because you built them. People value furniture they have assembled themselves more than identical furniture they purchased assembled. Investors value companies they have built more than equivalent companies they merely own. This matters practically when evaluating whether to sell something you've built or to abandon something you've created, because your assessment will be systematically biased toward overvaluing it. The in-kind fallacy, or chauffeur knowledge applied to self-assessment, is the tendency to assume that because you are competent in one domain, you have transferable competence in adjacent or entirely unrelated domains. The CEO who has built a successful manufacturing business assumes their strategic insight transfers directly to political leadership. The physician who is excellent at diagnosis assumes their analytical skills make them a good investor. The expertise is domain-specific in ways that are not always obvious from the inside. The omission bias is the tendency to judge harmful actions as more morally troubling than equally harmful inactions. Actively doing something that causes harm feels worse than passively failing to prevent the same harm, even when the outcomes are identical. This creates systematic distortions in how we evaluate decisions, particularly in medicine, public health, and policy, where the choice between action and inaction is often the central decision. The hot-cold empathy gap is the finding that we systematically underestimate how differently we will reason and behave when we are in a state of emotional arousal, hunger, fear, or desire than we do when we are calm. In a cold state, we confidently predict we would not be swayed by anger or hunger. In the hot state, we are in fact substantially influenced by these factors, often in ways we later find surprising or embarrassing. The practical implication is to make important commitments in calm states, and to be specifically suspicious of decisions made in emotional, hungry, or tired states. The zero-risk bias is the preference for options that eliminate a small risk entirely over options that reduce a much larger risk substantially. People prefer reducing the probability of some small risk from 2% to 0 over reducing the probability of a large risk from 40% to 20%, even though the second reduction represents a much larger absolute decrease in expected harm. 0 feels qualitatively different from very small, even when the arithmetic difference is far greater. Now let's address the fair criticisms of this book, because they deserve honest acknowledgement. The first criticism is one that Nassim Taleb raised publicly and seriously, that the book appropriated material from Taleb's own work, particularly from the manuscript of Antifragile, without adequate attribution. Taleb has been specific and forceful about this, and it is a legitimate criticism that Dobelli has addressed only partially. Readers who engage seriously with this book should also read Taleb's original work, both because it is where much of the intellectual substance originated, and because Taleb's treatment of these ideas is considerably more rigorous and more complete. The second criticism is structural. 99 short chapters covering 99 separate biases produces breadth at the expense of depth. Each bias receives roughly 3 to 5 pages, which is enough to understand what it is and to remember a memorable example, but often not enough to fully understand the mechanism, the research behind it, the conditions under which it is most likely to operate, or the range of practical situations in which it matters most. Readers who want a deeper understanding of the most important biases are better served by Kahneman's thinking, Fast and Slow, which covers fewer biases, but covers them with far greater rigor and depth. The third criticism is that the book's own tone has some overconfidence built in. The 99 biases are presented with a confidence of classification that somewhat understates how much genuine debate exists in the research literature about which biases are robustly replicated, which are domain-specific, which have been overstated in early research, and which interact in complex ways that simple chapter summaries don't capture. The replication crisis in psychology, which intensified significantly after this book was published, has complicated some of the research it cites. These criticisms taken together suggest that the best way to read this book is as an introduction to a body of ideas that deserves more thorough engagement in the original research and in more rigorous treatments, rather than as a complete and authoritative encyclopedia of human cognitive error. What remains genuinely valuable after holding these criticisms honestly is real and significant. The book provides perhaps the most accessible entry point available into the research on cognitive biases, covering the intellectual landscape clearly enough that a reader who comes to it with no prior background can finish it with a working vocabulary for the most important concepts and a genuine new awareness of the categories of error that systematically distort human judgment. That alone, given how poorly most people are equipped to recognize these errors in themselves, justifies the book's existence and its remarkable commercial success. Let's close with what I think is the most important meta point this book is making, the one that is in some ways buried under the 99 individual entries, but that gives the whole catalog its philosophical coherence. The book's deepest argument is about what good thinking actually requires. The standard assumption in a culture that prizes intelligence, education, and expertise is that good thinking is primarily about having more intelligence, more information, more analytical sophistication. The art of thinking clearly suggests something rather different. That good thinking is primarily about recognizing the systematic ways your thinking goes wrong and building your decision-making processes to compensate for them, not because you can overcome your biases through sheer intelligence, which you cannot, but because you can design systems that don't depend on you overcoming them in the moment. This is a genuinely humble position about the limits of rationality, and also a genuinely practical one. It says, "You are not as rational as you think you are. You cannot become fully rational through effort alone, but you can become systematically better at making decisions by building in the checks, the processes, the diverse perspectives, and the structural safeguards that compensate for the irrationality that will persist regardless of how much you know about it." That is not a glamorous message. It does not promise transformation or insight or a new way of seeing the world. It promises something considerably more modest and considerably more useful: a slightly better set of cognitive habits, a slightly better designed set of decision processes, a slightly lower probability of the most common and most costly errors. Over a lifetime of decisions, the compounding effect of these small improvements is substantial. Dobelli ends his book by noting that knowing about biases does not make you immune to them. He is himself, he admits, still subject to the biases he has cataloged. The goal is not immunity. The goal is awareness, the kind of awareness that makes you pause slightly longer before the most consequential decisions, that makes you more willing to seek the disconfirming evidence, that makes you more alert to the moment when multiple biases seem to be pushing in the same direction, and that makes you just slightly more likely to ask, before you commit, whether what feels like clear thinking might actually be a well-disguised error you have learned to recognize. It is not a book about becoming a different kind of thinker. It is a book about becoming a slightly more honest one. Tonight, before you make the next significant decision in your life, try one small thing. Identify the bias most likely to be distorting your evaluation of this specific choice, and ask what the decision would look like if you corrected for it. Not forever, not for every small decision, just for the next one that actually matters. That practice, applied selectively and honestly, is exactly what Michelangelo's method looks like in decision-making, not adding brilliance, removing stone. Thanks for watching all the way through. Think clearly, which mostly means notice what's stopping you from thinking clearly and try to stop doing that. Before we close, let me go deeper into something the book touches on, but that deserves more direct treatment: the relationship between cognitive biases and the specific professional and life domains where their consequences are largest. In investing and financial decision-making, the combination of biases is particularly costly because their errors compound over time in the same way that good decisions compound. The overconfidence effect makes investors believe they can reliably outperform markets that already incorporate the information available to them. Confirmation bias makes them seek out news and analysis that confirms their existing positions rather than genuinely evaluating contrary evidence. The sunk cost fallacy makes them hold losing positions long past the point where rational assessment would suggest selling. Anchoring makes the price they paid feel like the relevant reference point rather than the current market price. Availability bias makes recent market movements feel more predictive than they are. And survivorship bias means the investing strategies they study, because they're studying the strategies that produced visible successes, are systematically unrepresentative of the distribution of outcomes from those strategies. The consequence of this combination is that most active investors, despite genuine intelligence, effort, and access to information, consistently underperform passive index strategies over meaningful time periods, not because they are making random errors, but because they are making systematic, predictable, correlated errors in one direction. Understanding that this is happening doesn't solve the problem for most people, because the biases continue to operate even in people who are aware of them. The most reliable solution, as decades of data increasingly confirm, is to remove the cognitive biases from the investment process structurally by indexing, creating a system where biased human judgment doesn't make the individual stock-picking decisions. In medical decision-making, cognitive biases have consequences that go beyond financial. The availability heuristic can lead physicians to overdiagnose conditions that have recently been in the news or that they have recently treated several cases of. Confirmation bias causes premature closure. A preliminary diagnosis anchors the physician's interpretation of subsequent information in ways that make the actual diagnosis harder to revise even when the evidence supports a different one. The halo effect causes physical attractiveness to influence assessments of symptom severity and treatment need. Authority bias makes nurses and patients hesitant to challenge physicians, even when they have information that would be relevant to the clinical decision. And overconfidence across the board means that actual diagnostic accuracy in medicine is consistently below the confidence levels that practitioners report. The implication for patients is practical. In high-stakes medical decisions, don't assume that your physician's confidence reflects accurate calibration. Ask about alternatives, ask about error rates, ask about the evidence behind the recommended approach, and if the decision is significant enough, seek a second opinion from someone who hasn't been exposed to the first physician's framing. In organizational decision-making, biases interact in particularly destructive ways when they operate across groups. Groupthink, the tendency of cohesive groups to suppress dissent and converge on consensus position that no individual member might have reached independently, combines confirmation bias. The group seeks evidence for its preferred position. Social proof. Other group members' agreement is taken as validation. Authority bias. Senior members' views disproportionately weight the discussion. And in-group bias. The group's internal harmony takes precedence over accurate assessment of external reality. The result is organizations that make confident, coordinated decisions that individual members might have challenged, but that the group dynamic prevented from being challenged. The countermeasure at an organizational level is structural, building in deliberate dissent, using pre-mortem exercises where teams are instructed to assume the plan has failed and to generate every possible reason why, creating psychological safety for junior members to raise concerns, and separating the generation of options from the evaluation of options to prevent early convergence around one approach before alternatives have been fully considered. In personal relationships, The biases that matter most are those that affect how we interpret the behavior of people we are emotionally invested in. The halo effect causes us to interpret ambiguous behavior from people we love charitably and identical behavior from people we dislike uncharitably. Confirmation bias causes us to notice behavior that confirms our existing impressions of someone and to discount behavior that contradicts it. The fundamental attribution error, the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their character while attributing our own behavior to circumstances, causes us to judge others' mistakes more harshly than our own. And loss aversion causes relationships that should end to persist, because the prospect of loss is more psychologically salient than the prospect of what might be gained by moving on. None of these biases can be fully eliminated from personal relationships, and probably shouldn't be. Some degree of charitable interpretation of people we love is a feature of loving relationships rather than a bug. But becoming more aware of these tendencies, and specifically seeking moments of honest assessment rather than exclusively relying on the emotionally motivated processing that dominates our relationship thinking by default, does improve the quality of important decisions about relationships. Let me also briefly address something the book mentions, but that deserves more space. The question of when cognitive biases and heuristics are actually adaptive rather than errors. The book presents all 99 of its entries as errors, and the framing throughout is that clear thinking means overcoming these tendencies. But the research of psychologists like Gerd Giedrenzer, whom Dobelli references, suggests a more nuanced picture. Many of the heuristics that produce biases in laboratory experiments with artificial scenarios actually perform quite well in the real-world environments for which they evolved, because real-world environments often have structures that reward fast, simple rules rather than slow, complex analysis. This doesn't mean the biases Dobelli catalogs are not real or not costly in the context where they matter most. It means that the relationship between heuristic thinking and good decision-making is more complex than a simple biases are errors, framing captures. In environments characterized by genuine uncertainty, time pressure, and limited information, fast heuristics can outperform slow deliberation. In environments characterized by stable rules, measurable outcomes, and the time to deliberate, careful analysis can outperform fast heuristics. The key practical skill, which the book hints at but doesn't fully develop, is learning to distinguish which type of environment you're actually in, rather than defaulting to either fast heuristic or slow deliberation in all situations. Finally, let me address the question of what to actually do after reading this book. Because, as with all books about cognitive biases, the gap between knowing the material and changing behavior is significant. The most important first step is not to try to remember all 99 biases. That is neither feasible nor the right goal. The right goal is to internalize the general meta-principle that your thinking is systematically distorted in predictable ways, and to build a few specific habits that address the most consequential errors in your specific domains of decision-making. For most people, the highest impact habits are these. First, create a decision journal. Before making any significant decision, write down what you're deciding, what information you're using, how confident you are, and what you expect to happen. Review past entries to calibrate your actual accuracy against your felt confidence. Second, actively seek disconfirming evidence. For any important belief, find the 3 strongest arguments against it before you consider your belief settled. Third, define your reference class before you receive an anchor. For any significant decision involving numbers, form your own estimate before you are exposed to someone else's number. Fourth, consult base rates. For any plan, find out how similar plans have actually performed historically before projecting your own specific case. And fifth, Identify the 3 most likely cognitive biases affecting your current most important decision, and ask what the decision would look like without them. None of these habits are glamorous. None of them will produce immediate dramatic improvements, but each of them, applied consistently to significant decisions, removes some of the systematic stone that is obscuring the statue of clear thinking that is already inside you, waiting to emerge. Not through more thinking, through better calibrated thinking, not through more confidence, through better placed confidence, not through more information, through better processed information. The art of thinking clearly, in the end, is the art of getting out of your own way.